So the topic for this week is AI across the research stack screening. This is part two of a four-part series. And what we're going to cover here builds on our last session, which was search strategies, AI across the research stack for search strategies. First thing I'll cover that I covered in our last session as well. Literature reviews operate much more like a funnel than in stages, as most people like to think. So we typically think of stages like this: search, screening, full text review, synthesis. The way I view it, at least, is in fact that it's more like a funnel. You start with search to actually start to funnel the corpus of literature that's available out there on the topic. And then, search engines actually do that for you, but then you go through and decide which citations to bring into your library. Screening is then yet another step to determine which papers that you've brought in from search will continue through the process. Then you have full text review and screening, and then synthesis is almost the next level of vetting. That is the part of the funnel where you say, we've got our papers. What actual findings, anecdotes, data points am I going to pull from those papers and bring them into my own publication? And so I really think it's like a funnel. And in fact, a great illustration of that is the variability across researchers in the extent to which title and abstract screening is where you add filters to papers versus in the search engine itself. Quick recap of last week's Friday lab session on search strategy. I went through a detailed search strategy in PubMed, ran through some actual kind of Claude prompts that you can use to improve and build a search strategy, and then talked about systematic versus narrative reviews, as I generally do. The summary there is that systematic review search strategies are incredibly complex and involve a lot of what's effectively software development work. There is a need for more AI in preparing those strategies. Among other reasons, the AI is better, it seems, at coming up with search strategies based on a research objective. But then on top of it, kind of philosophically, I don't personally feel like we're cutting into any foundational research skills by automating the process of, generating the syntax associated with a search strategy. And then finally, need to better formalize narrative review search. That's a theme across every single session, webinar, workshop I ever do. And it shows up here as well, spoiler alert. But, you've got to keep in mind it's a bit of a feedback loop, as is every part of the research funnel. So in this case, let me just be really practical. If you go through a search strategy, you lay out your filters, you decide what citations to bring into your library. Keep in mind that you can start screening papers, and if you realize that those papers are not what you're looking for, i.e., there's certain papers that are out there that aren't covered, or you're running into a lot of papers that really have nothing to do with your topic or aren't, well screened in the search strategy stage, you might want to actually go back and revamp your search strategy. That could save you more time than just kind of powering through screening on maybe thousands of papers that aren't relevant. So it should be a back and forth process. Regardless, when you finish up your search strategy, particularly in a systematic review context, you have, at first I put tens. The reality is every search strategy should probably produce hundreds of papers. Depends on a lot of things, but I should say most should produce hundreds of papers, or you might even have thousands of papers. So what do you do with them next? And the answer, of course, is screen them with a solid plan. That is, I shouldn't say obviously, for many researchers, many folks going through literature reviews, I don't really think that happens, screening with a plan. And that I argue that's very, very important. So what does screening involve? Again, in a systematic review context, though we can see how this turns into kind of a more accessible, inexpensive narrative review context. Screening involves formally deduplication of papers and citations, developing inclusion and exclusion criteria. You want to do that up front. You want to think very carefully about that inclusion exclusion criteria. It's a high upfront cost, but that way when you're ripping through thousands of citations, it's a very low marginal cost exercise, and you eliminate all of the bias out of your screening process. And it's very kind of formulaic. It's something, once again, fairly easy to automate to a greater extent at least. Then generally there is a title and abstract screening phase, And here's where I would say about 90% of papers, citations get screened out of the process. It's just like the name implies. This is where you're, kind of formally, you have generally some kind of user interface, some page that just has title, abstract, maybe a little bit of metadata, and you are literally clicking include, exclude based on your criteria. And then full text screening, more detailed. Here you're actually starting to pick up some important, empirical findings that might end up being relevant for evidence synthesis. And you're going through just a more detailed process on each paper to determine if it's relevant or not. Maybe of the 10% left after title and abstract screening, maybe 50% will be kind of weeded out as a result of full text screening. And I think in many contexts, this does not necessarily mean it won't be cited. I happen to feel like maybe, for example, you might mention it as part of a directional finding in your publication that has 4 citations stamped to it, some kind of conclusion in the literature. Maybe actually one of those papers that you don't formally include in evidence synthesis to come up with your key conclusions might be mentioned. Nonetheless, these are the main stages, a pretty cookie cutter, kind of almost Prisma-like, diagram process. Dedupe, inclusion, exclusion criteria, title and abstract screening according to those criteria, full text screening according to those criteria, along with starting to really get familiar with the literature. And this is great because, going through this process, like if you go through this process of, again, you've got a couple hundred papers that are relevant. Without a screening process, you might end up reviewing a couple dozen of them and the rest just kind of fall off. You restart your computer, they're gone, whatever. It's a very imperfect process to go about screening without a formula like this. Formal screening, indeed, is the number one distinction between systematic and narrative reviews. We've talked about a lot of them, the different software products that are used. We talked about difference in search strategies, but screening is the number one, it seems to me. The fact that you've got one other key distinction, systematic reviews are usually dual. You've got multiple team members working on it. But again, screening's number one. With systematic reviews, it's more or less the process I just walked through. Title abstract screening, full text screening, all of it is documented with criteria. If you exclude a paper, there's an exclusion reason for it. Narrative reviews, I really can't emphasize this enough, look nothing like that. How I would describe the average narrative review, and I put out a LinkedIn post about this today, but without any kind of hyperbole, without any exaggeration, at least the narrative reviews I've seen and that, I've worked on, indeed, a lot of improvements to be made myself, is what I would call title screening. That's kind of the first step. You generally query a search engine. So search strategies, yet again, is an area where narrative reviews really need to be improved. But you generally query a search engine, whatever one you're kind of most familiar with a couple terms, whatever. The title screening involves just kind of scanning, right? And you've got a heuristics base. I'm not saying it's not scientific at all, but it's not a documented screening criteria. You've got kind of a heuristics-based screening criteria that you use to say that one's interesting and that one's not. How I do it is some software you use, search engines, you can check them off and save them down. I think what a lot of people do is just kind of right-click and add a new tab for each paper that's interesting, and then you just kind of fumble through those tabs. There are diverse screening tactics, I would say, when it comes to once you've got title screening done and you have your papers open, then how do you actually go through each in terms of title and abstract or full text screening to determine what's to be included? There's no formula. Very, very rarely is there a formula. There usually is no distinct title and abstract then full text formula. Instead, it seems to me it's a kind of judgmental methodology that's based on the amount of time you go through each paper. And so once again, for example, the amount you screen a paper just almost is based on the amount that paper hooks you and seems relevant. And then you might do a full text review right there in the first go. The problem with that is you might end up working on some papers that ultimately aren't that relevant. So you spend a lot of time on that. And also there might be some other papers that are way more relevant that you're missing. Maybe that's the number one issue. Like with me, it's you spend a lot of time reading through literature, like the first literature you come across. And if you don't have a calculated formula for it, then there might be some seminal paper that is just incredible. You come across it right before you're about to submit a publication or a report or something like that. So that is kind of the issue there. Just to show you what a title abstract screening page does look like, this is in Mora, Moara.io. We've got a really cool, fancy library. Then we have some super simple, basic workflow steps. I would not call our product a systematic review tool. Instead, I'd call it kind of a semi-systematic review tool, a very rigorous literature review tool. Indeed, you can use it with teams. You do have formal screening, but you don't need to have big risk of bias assessments and Prisma checklists and all sorts of compliance measures. It's much more for just large literature reviews conducted by teams. And in this case, you can see title abstract. There's some metadata down there. You can mark priority levels. We have a libkey integration. Assign folks, make tags, and record notes if you want to. And this makes it easy. You can just page by page rip through papers and screen them very quickly. Now, the main challenges with screening is that it's first weeks of work. If you've got thousands of citations, just imagine, yes, you might have a couple team members you can kind of allocate them across, but a lot of work, hard to keep track of everything. Long screening sessions, attention drops. Indeed, I think that's with any work activity, is that if it's before you have lunch, or for that matter, if you're tired at the end of the day, screening might not go so well. You might not be able to do what's effectively kind of manual human data extraction from titles and abstracts or full texts very effectively. Reviewers disagree a lot, 10 to 30% of the time. Maybe that's kind of inevitable, but it might be a good thing, by the way, but that's always an issue. You've got to have some conflict resolution logic in your system, or have conflict resolution processes with your team. And then time spent screening, of course, once again, kind of the formulaic, methodical, low marginal cost screening process. It's pretty mundane. It's pretty tedious. Not enough time spent thinking. Now, yes, it is true that when you read through a ton of abstracts, you end up getting a pretty good understanding of the literature on a topic, right? And what percentage of studies use this methodology and that one. But hypothetically, we could use some maybe newer technologies to actually answer those even more directly, catalog them, be able to get quickly top methodologies used, et cetera. And so we've got to figure out what parts of, say, title and abstract screening are useful and what parts should we automate. So, I focus on one use case in particular when it comes to using AI for screening. The main one is make include, exclude criteria feasible for every type of literature review out there. We need a very lightweight way to go about setting up some basic criteria, include, exclude criteria or fields you care about, and then, filtering through them very quickly. I'll reiterate, a narrative review researcher is not going to spend weeks going through titles and abstracts of 3,000 citations. So is there some other way we can do screening better? Now, let me get into, you might kind of say, well, if you're going to automate that, then I think that's a problem because you're not pouring through enough papers. I just want to be clear, search engines do that. So search engines go through a screening process based on our keywords and based on some filters we have. And so when it comes to the actual process of getting the right papers put together, we can acknowledge that there are some parts of it that really should be automated. And as an example of that, perhaps filter for only papers that use econometric methods and just delete everything else, assuming you're working with some very reliable LLM model, LLMs in your software, and you can rely on them to appropriately categorize papers. So I do think the main AI application for screening relates to data extraction against custom criteria in both title and abstract and full text screening. I've got a couple different models for what this looks like, but here would be a basic example right here. This is not something we offer in our product right now. I spun up this interface with Claude. And so as you can see, the idea is maybe you establish your include, exclude criteria up front. And then you have, as you go through title and abstract screening, you have LLMs that are actually running some models that check the abstract automatically against those criteria. And so, for example, again, you're looking for a randomized control trial, a certain type of experiment. Let's say you don't want it to be animal studies or something like that. LLMs can very effectively with abstracts. With full text, it's a little more complicated, but with abstracts, can pretty darn effectively with enough controls and proper build, can tell you whether or not those criteria are met and give you even a little bit of information about why they're met, or maybe what snippets from the abstract prove that they're met, or if they're not covered. So the question you got to ask yourself is this a good application? Will this meaningfully impede my understanding of an area of literature? That's going to be up to every researcher to decide. All depends on kind of what the scope of your research is and what you're trying to accomplish. But that is, in my view, the most obvious, best use case here is to automate the process of aligning extracting data from abstracts and then aligning them with include exclude criteria. However, I should mention it should still be the reviewer's final decision whether or not to include or exclude a paper. Now, some tools have automated include exclude. I want to reiterate that's what search engines do. Having said that, I do think with systematic reviews, it's the right balance. It strikes the right balance to actually review these fields and then click include, exclude, unsure yourself. That's my view. What this might look like at scale for the average review, I think it's safe to assume that every narrative review probably will not end up following this format. I think more should. And I think you've got, for example, large collaborative comprehensive literature reviews in some fields that should have workflow steps. But for the ones that don't and yet still want to take advantage of significant screening and still want to do comprehensive reviews, a really interesting way, and this one is in Mora, very interesting way to accomplish that is to use custom enrichments, i.e. custom columns. And so if you can, for example, have a study design column. And, once again, my view is particularly for title and abstract screening, but also full text reviews to an extent, you should be able to get this information very accurately, study design of each. Well, then, again, if you're looking for a certain type of study, does it make sense to actually filter out all others? So again, this is an interesting way to each column could be a separate kind of represent a separate include exclude criteria. In fact, with custom enrichments, custom columns, you can set out include exclude criteria. It can be a yes or no question. Is it a systematic review? Yes or no? You filter out the no's if you're looking for systematic reviews. Pretty straightforward, but that is I think the answer in my view is that we need to rely less on search engines and rely more on research libraries. I would argue that relying less on search engines, more on even highly automated research libraries allows for a more comprehensive view of the literature. Again, we rely on search engines for everything. So this would be a really scalable way to accomplish this for the average reviewer. Couple final slides here. Let's get into kind of a summary, though. I've talked a lot about this first bullet point, but let's get into some others. How AI can help with screening, and indeed how it is already helping, and some ways to think about how it's helping with existing tools. Indeed, LLM-based screening to apply custom inclusion exclusion criteria. Active learning is a really interesting one. We do not currently offer it in Mora, but it's a fascinating model. Active learning where models learn from earlier screening decisions. So that is, if you go through 100 papers and perhaps you're documenting well your exclusion criteria for some, well, then you can get better and better recommendations as you get to the second 100 papers and the third 100 papers because those models are learning about your preferences and what you're looking for. Final screening decisions, as I mentioned, should still be human-made in my view. Once again, that's not the case with search engines, but I think that's the right balance to strike at the moment. And then today, AI is strongest at reducing workload rather than making final decisions. The way I describe this is to say we should be using AI to get rid of all the really tedious stuff, all the really hard, tedious, data entry type stuff. Aim for 40 to 50% efficiency improvements. I think that's a reasonable goal. Limitations to keep in mind. Can you document and defend your AI assisted process, and can it be reproduced? I think that's, very important. So indeed, it is a problem when, for example, you use an AI model to find papers and then you need to show that that's reproducible. We know that AI models can be a little bit all over the place when it comes to what academic papers they put in what order. So I think you do need to do that. You also need to make sure that you're using good models, in short. So another way in which this shows up is black box problem. Hypothetically, with really bad models, it's definitely the case that you could have a include criterion that your LLMs tell you is met according to the abstract of a paper. You come back a day later and it says it's not met, or you should exclude the paper based on that criterion. So that could happen. The answer is use good models, especially initially, just like with ChatGPT and Claude. Double check your work and double check the work of your LLMs. But I think that's something definitely to keep in mind. Active learning tools learn from early decisions. So if you don't do a good job of being consistent in your early screening decisions, that propagates. And then finally, there's a whole range of emerging guidelines coming out about AI-assisted screening. Once again, that specifically relates to very formal health science type systematic reviews. But I would make sure to stay on top of them just to make sure you're not using any methods that are basically against recommendations and will affect your ultimate ability to get published. And finally, I already covered Mora a lot in this session. I'll just say one more time. Try Mora today, Moara.io, mother of all research assistants. Great place to manage research libraries, and we are constantly introducing new features along these lines. So really appreciate the time. Hope everyone has a great weekend. Thanks.